If a dog waits in the same place for 7 days without food, comfort, or explanation, perhaps it is not waiting for someone to return. Perhaps it is trying to convince the rest of us that we have forgotten something worth remembering. On the 7th morning, the fog hung low across the mountains outside Libby, Montana, softening every pine tree into a pale silhouette. Moisture clung to the cedar branches, and the cold scent of wet earth drifted through the silent forest with every gentle breeze. The old cabin stood exactly where it always had, hidden beyond a forgotten logging road that most people in town no longer bothered to mention. Its weathered porch sagged slightly beneath the weight of countless winters. Moss covered the roof. Wildflowers had claimed the narrow stone path leading to the front steps. Nothing about the place suggested that anyone had lived there for years. Yet every sunrise, before the first pickup truck rolled through town and before the local diner opened its doors, a lone German shepherd quietly climbed the porch, turned once in a slow circle, and sat facing the faded front door. He did not bark. He did not scratch the wood. He simply waited. The people of Libby noticed on the first day, but assumed the dog belonged to a hiker. By the third day, they began leaving bowls of water nearby, though the shepherd rarely touched them until sunset. By the 5th day, curiosity replaced sympathy. Conversations drifted through the grocery store, the gas station, and the small post office. Some believed the dog had become confused after losing his owner. Others insisted animals often returned to places where they had once been loved. A few quietly suggested it was time for animal control to intervene before the loyal creature wandered deeper into the wilderness. Only one person refused to interrupt the silent ritual. Ethan Walker parked his aging green pickup beneath the tall pines every morning and watched from a respectful distance. At 42, the retired United States Marine had learned that loyalty often looked strange to people who had never depended upon it for survival. He stood beside the truck with a steaming enamel mug warming his hands. His faded olive field jacket zipped against the crisp mountain air. His weathered face remained calm beneath short, dark hair already touched by silver, while his gray-blue eyes never left the motionless German shepherd sitting upon the porch. Ranger had shared Ethan's life for nearly 5 years. The dog had crossed rivers beside him, climbed mountain trails without complaint, and somehow sensed every restless night before Ethan admitted sleep had once again abandoned him. Ranger never acted without reason. That simple truth had become one of the few certainties Ethan still trusted. On the morning of the 7th day, several townspeople gathered quietly near the edge of the clearing. No one spoke above a whisper. The dog had not moved since sunrise. The forest itself seemed unusually still, as though even the wind hesitated to disturb whatever promise held the shepherd there. Ethan slowly approached until he stood only a few feet from Ranger. The German shepherd acknowledged him with a brief glance, his amber eyes calm, patient, and strangely expectant, before turning back toward the silent cabin door. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. The old windows reflected nothing except drifting clouds and towering pines. There was no smoke from the chimney, no footprints across the porch, no sound behind the faded wooden walls. Yet something deep inside Ethan whispered that Ranger was not waiting for someone inside the cabin. He was waiting for someone willing to understand why. The mountain remained quiet long after the townspeople drifted back toward their ordinary routines, but Ethan Walker stayed where he was, leaning lightly against the hood of his weathered pickup as the morning sun slowly dissolved the last traces of fog. Ranger never looked away from the cabin door. Hours passed with almost no movement except the gentle rise and fall of the German shepherd's breathing and the occasional breeze stirring his sable coat. Ethan had known the dog long enough to recognize the difference between stubbornness and purpose. This was purpose. 5 years earlier, when Ethan first met Ranger through a veterans rehabilitation program in Helena, the young German shepherd had ignored every volunteer who tried to earn his attention. Instead, the dog had walked directly across the training yard and quietly sat beside Ethan without making a sound. The instructors had laughed softly and said that some dogs simply chose their people instead of waiting to be chosen. Ethan had never questioned that moment. Neither had Ranger. Since then, they had built a life measured not by excitement, but by steady routines. Before sunrise, they walked narrow forest trails winding through towering lodgepole pines. After breakfast, Ethan repaired old fences, split firewood, or helped neighbors with small jobs around town. Ranger remained nearby through every task, never wandering far and never demanding attention. When evening settled across the valley, they often sat together on the porch of Ethan's modest cabin, watching deer emerge from the trees while coffee cooled quietly in an enamel mug. Conversation was unnecessary. Silence had become its own language between them. Most people in Libby respected Ethan without truly knowing him. They recognized him as the polite veteran who always returned borrowed tools cleaner than he received them and who never missed the annual memorial service downtown. Few realized how difficult those quiet years had been. Sleep rarely stayed through the night. Certain sounds still carried memories that arrived without warning. Ethan never spoke about those burdens because he believed everyone carried something invisible. Ranger seemed to understand that truth better than anyone. On restless nights, the German Shepherd would leave his favorite blanket beside the fireplace and settle silently near Ethan's chair until dawn painted the windows gold again. The dog never tried to fix anything. He simply refused to let Ethan face darkness alone. That unwavering loyalty made the events of the past week impossible to ignore. Ranger had abandoned every familiar habit. He no longer waited by the truck each morning. He barely touched breakfast before walking the same forgotten trail toward the abandoned cabin. Each afternoon, Ethan brought fresh water and a small meal, setting both beside the porch without interrupting the dog's silent vigil. Ranger accepted only enough to remain healthy before returning to the exact same spot facing the weathered front door. He never scratched it, never whined, never searched the surrounding woods. It was as though an invisible line connected him to the cabin itself. Late that afternoon, an elderly neighbor named Walter Hayes pulled his pickup beside Ethan's. Walter removed his faded baseball cap and glanced toward the motionless shepherd. "I have lived here almost 50 years, he said quietly. "That place has been empty longer than I can remember." Ethan nodded without taking his eyes off Ranger. Walter hesitated before continuing. "Sometimes it is kinder to let go." Ethan looked down at the German Shepherd, whose calm amber eyes remained fixed upon the silent cabin. A gentle breeze carried the scent of old cedar, mountain sage, and distant rain across the clearing. Ethan smiled almost imperceptibly. "Maybe," he answered softly. "Or maybe he is waiting because somebody else gave up too soon." As the evening light settled across the weathered porch, Ranger slowly stood for the first time all day. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. The German Shepherd stepped toward the faded wooden door, lowered his nose to the weathered threshold, then quietly turned his head toward the narrow forest path disappearing behind the cabin, as though the real destination had never been the cabin at all. The last rays of daylight slipped quietly between the towering pines as Ethan followed Ranger's gaze toward the narrow trail disappearing behind the abandoned cabin. The German Shepherd did not move immediately. He remained standing beside the weathered porch, ears lifted, tail perfectly still, watching the hidden path with a patience that seemed almost impossible to explain. Ethan had seen that posture only a handful of times before. Ranger stood exactly the same way whenever he sensed something important during search exercises years earlier, focused without fear, calm without hesitation. The retired Marine slowly set his empty coffee mug on the hood of the truck and stepped toward the cabin. The old wooden boards beneath his boots answered with soft creaks that echoed across the silent clearing. Moss covered the porch railing, and tiny wildflowers pushed through cracks between the stones below. The front door remained tightly shut, its faded blue paint peeling beneath decades of mountain winters. Ethan rested one hand against the weathered wood. It felt cold, rough, and completely still. There were no voices inside. No footsteps. Not even the faint sound of settling timber. Everything suggested the cabin had been abandoned exactly as the townspeople claimed. Yet Ranger continued watching the forest behind it rather than the building itself. Ethan slowly circled the cabin while the German Shepherd followed several feet behind. The rear wall faced a gentle hillside where dense cedar trees cast long evening shadows across the ground. A faint footpath, almost completely hidden beneath pine needles and moss, stretched into the forest beyond. Most people would have walked past it without noticing. Ranger stopped at the beginning of the trail and lowered his nose to the earth. He inhaled deeply once, then looked toward Ethan instead of moving forward. It was not a command. It was an invitation. Ethan studied the forgotten path carefully. The forest floor revealed almost nothing except scattered leaves, old cones, and damp earth darkened by recent rain. Then a small detail caught his attention. A narrow section of moss appeared slightly compressed, as though something heavy had rested there not long ago. He knelt, brushing away loose pine needles with the back of his hand. Beneath them, he discovered the faint outline of an old boot print. Time and weather had softened its edges until it barely remained visible, but it was unmistakably human. Ranger quietly stepped beside him without disturbing the ground. His amber eyes never left Ethan's face. The retired Marine measured the print with a thoughtful glance. It was not fresh, perhaps months old, perhaps even longer. Still, it proved one simple fact. Someone had once walked this hidden trail after everyone else had forgotten it existed. A cool breeze drifted down the hillside carrying the clean scent of cedar, damp stone, and something unexpectedly familiar. Coffee. Fresh coffee. Ethan frowned. The fragrance lasted only a heartbeat before dissolving into the evening air. He looked toward Ranger, wondering whether the dog had noticed it as well. Ranger lifted his head slightly, but showed no surprise. Instead, he quietly walked a few yards farther along the hidden trail before stopping beside an enormous white pine whose roots spread across the hillside like weathered hands. There he sat once more, facing the forest beyond with the same unwavering patience he had shown outside the cabin for 7 long days. Ethan followed slowly until he stood beside his companion. The woods ahead appeared empty, washed in fading amber light. Then, just as the first evening star emerged above the mountain ridge, a single metallic chime floated softly through the trees. It was delicate, almost gentle, like a small bronze bell moving in a breeze too light to feel. Ethan held his breath. Ranger did not react with surprise. Instead, the German shepherd calmly lowered his head, as though hearing a sound he had been waiting for all along. The gentle chime faded into the evening air, leaving behind a silence so complete that Ethan could hear the slow rhythm of Ranger's breathing beside him. Neither of them moved. The towering white pine stretched high above their heads, its branches swaying almost imperceptibly against a sky slowly turning shades of amber and deep blue. Ethan listened carefully, hoping the sound would return, but only the whisper of wind through cedar needles reached his ears. Ranger remained seated with remarkable composure, his amber eyes fixed on the forest beyond the tree, as though waiting for permission to continue. Ethan trusted that look more than he trusted coincidence. He took one careful step forward, then another, allowing the hidden trail to guide him deeper between the ancient pines. The path narrowed until it became little more than a faint opening through ferns and moss. It felt less like a hiking trail and more like a place remembered only by time itself. The farther they walked, the cooler the air became. The scent of damp cedar mixed with wild sage and the faint sweetness of pine, resin warming beneath the last rays of sunlight. Ethan noticed small details that most people would have overlooked. A weathered wooden fence post leaning beneath climbing ivy. A rusted horseshoe hanging from a broken branch. Flat stones arranged almost naturally beside the trail, yet somehow suggesting that careful hands had once placed them there. Ranger never hesitated. Every few yards, he paused only long enough to glance back toward Ethan before continuing. There was no urgency in his pace. Whatever had drawn him here seemed willing to wait. After several quiet minutes, they entered a small clearing where the forest opened beneath the fading sky. At its center stood an old wooden pole rising from a circle of smooth river stones. Hanging from the crossbeam was a tiny bronze bell darkened with age. A faded blue ribbon remained tied beneath it, its edges worn by countless seasons of wind and snow. Ethan approached slowly. The bell looked ordinary, yet something about it stirred an old memory resting just beyond reach. He lifted one hand and gently touched the cool bronze surface. It swayed lightly, releasing the same delicate note that had drifted through the trees only moments earlier. Ranger lowered his head respectfully, almost as if greeting an old friend. Ethan's eyes wandered to the weathered wooden post supporting the bell. Carved into its surface, nearly hidden beneath years of rain and moss, were 2 initials enclosed inside a simple circle. E.W. His breath caught. Those were his own initials. Ethan traced the faded carving with trembling fingertips, unable to understand how they could possibly be there. He had never visited this clearing before. At least he believed he had not. Ranger quietly walked around the circle of stones before stopping beside a moss-covered bench facing the bell. The old bench had nearly disappeared beneath nature's patient embrace, yet it remained surprisingly sturdy. Ethan sat slowly, still unable to take his eyes from the carved initials. As evening shadows lengthened across the clearing, another gentle breeze stirred the blue ribbon. The bell chimed once more, softer this time, while a single folded piece of yellowed paper slipped from beneath the bench onto the forest floor. Ethan reached down and carefully picked it up. Across the front, written in faded handwriting that had survived years of mountain weather, appeared only 3 simple words. For Ethan Walker. The yellowed paper rested lightly in Ethan's hands, its edges softened by years of mountain air and careful folding. He hesitated before opening it, almost afraid that unfolding the fragile page might somehow disturb the quiet mystery that had guided Ranger here. The German shepherd settled calmly beside the weathered bench, his eyes never leaving Ethan, his breathing slow and steady as if he already understood every word hidden inside the letter. A cool breeze drifted through the clearing, carrying the scent of cedar, pine needles, and distant rain, while the little bronze bell gave one gentle note before falling silent again. Ethan carefully unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat, familiar, and unmistakably American, written by someone whose hand had remained steady despite the passing years. The first sentence stopped him completely. "If you are reading this, old friend, then the one sitting beside you has done exactly what I hoped he would." Ethan lowered the letter for a moment, glancing toward Ranger with quiet disbelief. The German shepherd simply blinked and rested his head upon his front paws. Ethan continued reading. The writer never introduced himself immediately. Instead, he spoke about loyalty. He wrote that people often underestimated dogs because they believed animals only remembered commands, but truly faithful dogs remembered promises, places, and hearts. They noticed what people forgot. They waited when others walked away. They carried hope long after human patience had faded. Ethan felt an unexpected warmth settle across his chest as the words flowed gently from one memory to another. The writer described an old cabin hidden beyond the trees, a bell that should only ring when someone finally returned, and a friendship that had once been stronger than silence. Ethan searched his memory again, feeling names and faces drifting just beyond reach like shapes hidden inside morning fog. The letter ended abruptly, not because it was unfinished, but because only one short instruction remained. The rest is waiting inside the cabin. Ethan slowly folded the paper once more. There was no signature, only a small symbol drawn beneath the final sentence. A simple compass rose. Something about it stirred another forgotten memory. Ranger quietly stood before Ethan even had the chance to speak. The German shepherd looked toward the abandoned cabin through the trees, then began walking back along the narrow trail without hesitation. This time he did not stop or glance behind him. Ethan followed, carrying the folded letter carefully inside his jacket pocket. Twilight settled gently across the forest as they retraced every step. The old bell disappeared behind them, its clearing swallowed once again by towering pines. When the cabin finally emerged through the trees, it seemed somehow different. The fading evening light painted the weathered walls in warm shades of amber instead of gray. The broken porch no longer appeared forgotten. It looked patient. Ranger climbed the steps first and quietly sat before the faded front door exactly where he had remained for 7 long days. Ethan reached for the worn brass doorknob, expecting it to remain locked like every abandoned building he had ever known. Instead, with the slightest turn of his wrist, the old latch released effortlessly. The door drifted inward on its own with a soft wooden sigh. Cool air carrying the unmistakable scent of cedar, aged books, and freshly brewed coffee floated gently out into the evening. Ethan stood completely still. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, no voices inside, and no signs that another person had entered the cabin for years. Yet the rich aroma of fresh coffee lingered in the quiet room with impossible clarity. Ranger slowly walked across the threshold, paused only once, then looked back toward Ethan with calm amber eyes that seemed to say the waiting was finally over. The cabin welcomed them with the quiet dignity of a place that had never stopped expecting company. Ethan stepped across the worn threshold slowly, his boots stirring only a thin layer of dust that shimmered in the fading sunlight pouring through the old windows. Ranger entered. Without hesitation, moving through the room with calm familiarity instead of curiosity. He did not sniff the corners or investigate forgotten furniture the way most dogs would. He simply walked to the stone fireplace and sat beside it, watching Ethan with patient amber eyes. The rich scent of fresh coffee still lingered in the cool air, blending with aged cedar, old leather, and the faint fragrance of pine carried through a cracked window. It was impossible. Every surface suggested that no one had lived there for years, yet the room felt carefully preserved rather than abandoned. A cast-iron kettle rested neatly upon the stove. 2 enamel mugs stood side by side on a rough cedar table. A folded wool blanket remained draped across the back of a rocking chair as though someone had intended to return before sunset. Ethan slowly removed his jacket and laid it over another chair without taking his eyes from the room. The silence did not feel empty. It felt respectful. Above the fireplace hung several faded photographs held carefully beneath simple wooden frames. Ethan stepped closer. The first showed a younger Marine standing beside a mountain lake with a broad smile that stirred something deep inside his memory. The next captured 2 men sitting outside this very cabin, coffee mugs raised toward the sunrise. Ethan frowned. One of those men was unmistakably himself, nearly 20 years younger, laughing at something outside the frame. His heart skipped. He reached toward the photograph with trembling fingers, tracing the familiar face he somehow could not remember visiting this place with. Ranger quietly rose and approached a narrow bookshelf beside the fireplace. Instead of barking, he gently touched the lowest shelf with his nose. A worn leather journal slid forward slightly before coming to rest against the edge. Ethan knelt and carefully lifted it into his hands. The cover had softened with age, its corners rounded from years of use. Pressed into the leather were the same small compass rose symbol he had seen on the folded letter beneath the bell. He opened the first page. Written in careful handwriting were 6 simple words. For the day's memory, chooses silence. Ethan slowly turned another page. Every entry carried dates stretching back more than 15 years. They described ordinary mornings, fishing trips, quiet conversations, changing seasons, and endless cups of coffee shared on the porch. There was no bitterness, no regret, only gratitude for small moments that most people overlooked. Then Ethan reached an entry dated exactly 5 years earlier, only weeks before he adopted Ranger. The words seemed to breathe beneath the fading light. If my strength fails before my friend remembers this place, I trust the young shepherd. Dogs have a way of carrying promises farther than people ever can. They never confuse time with love. Ethan stopped reading. He looked slowly toward Ranger, whose calm expression had not changed since they entered the cabin. For the first time, Ethan understood that the German shepherd had not begun this journey 7 days ago. It had begun years earlier, long before they had ever met. As twilight settled gently outside, a loose photograph slipped quietly from between the journal's pages and landed face up on the wooden floor. It showed a younger Ranger as a playful puppy sitting beside an older white-haired Marine whose warm smile finally unlocked the memory Ethan had been chasing all evening. He whispered the name before he even realized the words had left his lips. Samuel. Samuel Carter. The name echoed softly through the quiet cabin, awakening memories Ethan had buried beneath years of ordinary routines and careful silence. He lowered himself into the old rocking chair beside the fireplace, the worn leather journal resting across his knees while Ranger quietly settled at his feet. Outside, the last light of day faded behind the towering pines, leaving the room wrapped in a warm amber glow cast by the evening sky. Ethan closed his eyes for a long moment. Then the memories finally came, not in fragments this time, but like a river finding its forgotten course. Samuel had not simply been another Marine. He had been Ethan's closest friend after both men left military service. While many veterans tried to outrun difficult memories, Samuel believed healing required the opposite. Every September, he invited Ethan into the Montana mountains for 3 quiet days without telephones, news, or schedules. They drank coffee before sunrise, hiked forgotten trails, repaired little things around the old cabin, and spent long evenings talking only when words arrived naturally. Samuel often smiled, and said that silence was never empty when shared with someone who understood it. Ethan remembered laughing at those words, believing they sounded far too poetic for an old Marine. Yet somehow Samuel always managed to be right. The journal rested open upon another entry dated 4 years before Samuel disappeared from Ethan's life. The handwriting remained steady and calm. Today, Ranger chased pine cones until sunset. He is still young enough to believe every stick is worth carrying home. I hope he never loses that gift. Some creatures remind us that joy does not need a reason. Ethan looked down at the German shepherd sleeping peacefully beside the chair. Ranger opened one eye for a brief moment before gently thumping his tail once against the wooden floor, as though acknowledging the words written years before. Ethan smiled quietly. He turned another page. The entries gradually became shorter. Samuel wrote about growing weaker, though he never complained. Instead, he described the changing seasons, the songs of morning birds, the smell of fresh cedar after rain, and every September sunrise viewed from the cabin porch. Finally, Ethan reached the last completed page. The handwriting appeared slightly less steady, but remained unmistakably hopeful. If you are reading this, then Ranger found you exactly when he believed your heart was ready. I never trained him to bring you here. I only loved him enough that he learned where love always returns. Ethan felt tears gathering before he even realized he was crying. They came quietly, without struggle, carrying years of unanswered questions away with them. He had spent so long believing he failed Samuel by allowing distance to grow between them that he never imagined his friend had understood everything without needing an explanation. Samuel had never waited for apologies. He had simply trusted time, a faithful dog, and the mountains. They both loved. Ranger slowly stood and rested his head against Ethan's hand. The warmth of the shepherd's fur grounded him in the present. Ethan gently stroked the dog's neck while looking once more around the peaceful cabin. 2 coffee mugs still waited upon the table. 2 chairs still faced the porch windows overlooking the endless forest. Nothing inside this place spoke of endings. It spoke only of promises patiently preserved. As Ethan prepared to close the journal for the night, another folded envelope slipped quietly from the back cover onto the floor. Unlike the first letter, this one bore a familiar date. September 18th. Tomorrow. The envelope rested quietly in Ethan's hands while the cabin settled into the peaceful silence of evening. Ranger remained curled beside the fireplace, though his ears lifted slightly as if he understood that another forgotten chapter was about to unfold. Outside, moonlight spread gently across the porch, turning the surrounding pines into silver silhouettes against the Montana sky. Ethan traced the faded date written across the front of the envelope with his thumb. September 18th. Tomorrow. He remembered that date now with complete clarity. It had always belonged to them. Every year Samuel insisted they greet the sunrise together on September 18th, believing that one morning spent in gratitude could carry a person through an entire year. Ethan slowly broke the brittle seal and unfolded the carefully preserved pages inside. Samuel's familiar handwriting greeted him once again. If today is September 18th, then you finally made it back. If it is not, stay one more night. The mountain has always been patient. You should be too. Ethan smiled through quiet tears. He looked toward the small calendar still hanging crookedly beside the cabin door. The faded pages showed an old month from years ago, useless for keeping time now. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone, surprised to find a single bar of signal reaching the remote cabin. The screen confirmed what his heart had somehow already known. Tomorrow would indeed be September 18th. Samuel continued writing about simple things rather than grand revelations. He described the first cup of coffee before sunrise, the way fog drifted through the valley below the porch, the sound of the bronze bell whenever the morning breeze arrived from the western ridge, and the comfort of sharing silence with someone who never demanded explanations. Then Ethan reached the final paragraph. Ranger will know when it is time. Do not ask how. Just trust him the way he has always trusted you. Before sunrise, follow wherever he chooses to stop. There is one promise left that belongs to both of us. Ethan lowered the letter into his lap. The room felt warmer than before, filled not with mystery, but with quiet familiarity. He suddenly realized why the cabin had never felt abandoned. Samuel had filled every corner with intention. Nothing inside existed by accident. Even the two enamel mugs waiting patiently on the cedar table had remained exactly where they had shared countless mornings together. Ethan rose and walked to the tiny kitchen. He filled the old kettle with fresh water from the hand pump beside the sink and placed it carefully upon the cast-iron stove. A box of neatly stacked firewood still rested beside the hearth. Within minutes, a small fire crackled softly, filling the cabin with gentle warmth and dancing light. Ranger lifted his head, watching the familiar routine with peaceful satisfaction before resting once more. Ethan prepared coffee in the old enamel pot exactly as Samuel had taught him years before, measuring each scoop slowly and never rushing the process. When the rich aroma filled the room again, it no longer felt impossible. It felt like home. He poured 2 steaming mugs and placed one across the table opposite his own without thinking. The empty chair no longer represented loss. It represented gratitude. They had shared enough sunrises together that absence could never erase them. Long after midnight, Ethan fell asleep in the old rocking chair with the journal resting against his chest, while Ranger remained quietly beside the front door. Just before dawn, the German shepherd gently stood, walked to Ethan, and softly touched his hand with his nose. Ethan opened his eyes immediately. Ranger was already facing the door. Outside, through the cabin window, the first pale ribbon of morning light appeared above the distant mountains, and somewhere beyond the towering pines, the little bronze bell rang once, welcoming a new day that had been waiting for many years. Before the first rays of sunlight reached the porch, Ranger stepped quietly into the cool morning air without looking back. Ethan picked up the 2 warm enamel mugs, handed one instinctively toward the empty space beside him before smiling at his own habit, then gently set it back on the cedar table. He slipped Samuel's journal into his field jacket, adjusted the old military identification tags beneath his collar, and followed the German shepherd into the pale blue dawn. The forest felt different than it had the evening before. Mist rested low across the valley, but it no longer seemed mysterious. Instead, it drifted peacefully between the towering pines like slow-moving clouds searching for a place to disappear. Every breath carried the familiar scent of cedar, fresh coffee lingering on Ethan's hands, damp earth, and the crisp sweetness of mountain air. Ranger walked ahead with measured confidence, never hurrying, never hesitating. He followed the same narrow trail leading past the little bronze bell and into the quiet clearing where Ethan had discovered the first letter. This time the shepherd continued beyond the weathered bench, climbing a gentle rise covered with emerald moss and clusters of tiny blue wildflowers. Ethan remained only a few steps behind. The eastern horizon slowly brightened, painting the tops of the pine trees with soft shades of gold. Birds welcomed the morning one gentle song at a time until the entire forest seemed to awaken together. Ranger finally stopped beneath an enormous white pine overlooking the valley below. Its trunk stretched skyward with quiet strength, its roots spreading across the hillside like welcoming arms. At the base of the tree rested a smooth granite stone no larger than an ordinary suitcase. It carried no grand monument, only a small bronze plaque weathered by years of snow and sunlight. Ethan knelt slowly, brushing away fallen pine needles that had gathered across its surface. The inscription was simple: Samuel Carter, United States Marine, friend, keeper of promises. Below those words appeared a sentence Ethan recognized immediately because Samuel had spoken it countless times while pouring coffee before sunrise. No one walks home alone. Ethan lowered his head, allowing the quiet morning to settle around him. Ranger moved closer until his shoulder rested gently against Ethan's arm. Together they watched the first edge of the sun rise above the distant mountains, filling the valley with warm light that chased the last ribbons of fog toward the horizon. Ethan reached into his jacket and removed the folded letter Samuel had written years before. He read the final lines once more beneath the growing light. If you are here on this morning, then we kept our promise after all. We simply arrived by different roads. Do not remember me with sadness. Brew 2 cups of coffee every September. Share one with whoever needs company the most. That will be enough. Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it beneath the smooth granite stone, securing it from the breeze with a small pine cone that had fallen beside the tree. Ranger quietly sat facing the sunrise, his ears relaxed and his amber eyes reflecting the golden light. The bronze bell behind them chimed softly once more, carried by the gentle western breeze exactly as Samuel had described. Ethan smiled through peaceful tears. He finally understood why Ranger had waited outside the empty cabin for 7 long days. The dog had never been waiting for someone hidden inside those weathered walls. He had been waiting until Ethan's heart was ready to finish a journey that another faithful friend had begun many years before. As the warm sunlight spread across the mountainside, Ethan rested one hand upon Ranger's neck, and together they remained beneath the great white pine, saying nothing at all because, at last, nothing more needed to be said. The sun climbed higher above the Montana mountains, filling the valley with warm light that lingered gently across the granite stone beneath the great white pine. Ethan remained there for a long while, one hand resting lightly on Ranger's neck while the quiet rhythm of the forest surrounded them. Birds moved from branch to branch overhead. A squirrel paused along a weathered log before disappearing into the trees. The little bronze bell rang only once more before the morning breeze settled into peaceful stillness. Nothing extraordinary happened after that. No mysterious voices filled the clearing. No impossible signs appeared in the sky. Somehow that made the moment even more meaningful. Samuel had always believed that the greatest miracles rarely announced themselves. They arrived disguised as ordinary mornings, shared with grateful hearts. Ethan finally stood and looked down at the smooth granite marker one last time before turning toward the narrow trail. Ranger rose immediately, stretching comfortably before falling into step beside him. This time the German Shepherd did not lead several yards ahead as he had throughout the past week. Instead, he walked quietly at Ethan's side, matching every pace without looking back toward the white pine. It was a small change, almost impossible for anyone else to notice, but Ethan understood it immediately. Ranger's silent mission had finally been completed. They returned to the cabin beneath a sky that had become brilliantly clear, the last traces of fog completely erased by sunlight. The weathered porch no longer appeared forgotten. Fresh light reflected warmly from the old windows, and the faded blue front door stood slightly open, welcoming the mountain air inside. Ethan stepped into the familiar room, carrying a calmness he had not felt in years. The 2 enamel coffee mugs still rested upon the cedar table exactly where he had left them before sunrise. He quietly washed both mugs in the small kitchen sink, dried them with a clean towel, and placed them side by side upon the shelf above the stove. The simple routine felt almost sacred. Ranger wandered slowly through the cabin before settling comfortably near the fireplace, where he released a long, peaceful sigh and closed his eyes. Ethan smiled softly. It was the deepest rest he had seen the German Shepherd take since the first day of the mysterious journey. He opened Samuel's journal once more and carefully turned to the final blank page. Beneath years of thoughtful entries describing changing seasons, quiet conversations, and faithful mornings, Ethan wrote only a few simple lines. I found the sunrise. Ranger never stopped believing. Thank you for waiting until I remembered the way home. He closed the journal gently and returned it to the bookshelf where Ranger had first discovered it. Beside the journal, he placed the folded photograph showing the younger version of himself smiling beside Samuel on the cabin porch. For the first time in many years, Ethan no longer wished he could return to those days. Instead, he felt grateful they had happened at all. Late that afternoon, he stepped outside carrying a hammer, fresh cedar boards, and a small toolbox from his truck. The porch had weathered many hard winters, and several loose planks needed replacing before another season arrived. Ranger watched quietly from the shade while Ethan worked with steady hands, repairing each board one at a time. It was not simply maintenance. It was a promise continuing through ordinary actions. Every nail driven into the old wood felt like gratitude taking visible shape. As evening approached, warm golden light settled across the cabin once again. Ethan carried 2 steaming mugs of fresh coffee onto the porch and placed one upon the empty chair beside his own. He lifted his cup toward the peaceful mountains stretching beyond the pines and smiled without sadness. Somewhere far below, the quiet town continued its ordinary day, never knowing why the faithful German Shepherd had waited outside an empty cabin for 7 patient mornings. Ethan knew now that some stories were never meant to convince everyone. They only needed to change one heart, and sometimes that was more than enough. Autumn settled gently across the Montana mountains during the weeks that followed, painting the towering aspens in brilliant shades of gold, while cool mornings filled the valleys with soft ribbons of mist. Ethan found himself returning to the old cabin almost every weekend, never because he felt obligated, but because the place had quietly become part of his life again. Ranger no longer hurried ahead or waited silently upon the porch as he had for those unforgettable 7 days. Instead, the German shepherd walked beside Ethan with an easy confidence, stopping now and then to investigate the scent of fresh pine needles or watch deer grazing peacefully beyond the tree line. Whatever burden he had faithfully carried seemed to have lifted. The cabin slowly changed as well. Ethan repaired loose boards along the porch, replaced cracked window panes with clear glass, swept years of fallen leaves from the stone path, and carefully restored the little bronze bell until its warm tone once again carried gently across the forest whenever the breeze arrived from the western ridge. Inside, he dusted the bookshelves, polished the old cast-iron stove, and folded fresh blankets across the familiar rocking chair without disturbing the quiet arrangement Samuel had left behind. Every small task felt less like restoring a building and more like honoring a friendship that had patiently survived time itself. Word eventually spread through the nearby town that someone had begun caring for the abandoned cabin again. Curious neighbors occasionally stopped along the old logging road to see whether the stories were true. Walter Hayes was the first to arrive. The elderly neighbor climbed slowly onto the porch, removed his weathered cap, and looked around with a quiet smile. He noticed the repaired steps, the fresh cedar scent drifting from newly sanded boards, and the two enamel mugs resting side by side upon the porch railing. He did not ask many questions. Instead, he simply nodded toward Ranger, who lay peacefully near the doorway watching the forest. "Looks like he knew exactly what he was doing," Walter said softly. Ethan smiled and looked toward his faithful companion. "He always did," he answered. Over the following days, others came as well. A young couple hiking through the mountains paused to admire the restored cabin. A retired schoolteacher left a basket of homemade bread on the porch without expecting anything in return. One afternoon, another veteran stopped by after hearing there was coffee waiting for anyone who needed a quiet place to sit. Ethan welcomed each visitor with the same simple kindness Samuel had once offered him. There were never speeches about healing or grand conversations about the past. Sometimes they talked about fishing, changing weather, or favorite mountain trails. Sometimes they said almost nothing at all while watching sunlight drift across the valley. Ranger greeted every guest with calm patience before settling quietly nearby, as though he understood that some people needed silence more than conversation. One cool evening, after the last visitor had gone home, Ethan sat alone upon the porch holding a warm mug of coffee while Ranger rested beside his boots. The sky slowly filled with stars brighter than any city could ever reveal. He realized something had changed inside him without his noticing. For years he had measured life by everything he believed he had lost. Now he found himself noticing everything that remained. Friendship, loyalty, morning light, the steady rhythm of boots on old wooden boards, the comforting weight of a faithful dog leaning gently against his leg. Above them, the little bronze bell moved softly in the evening breeze, releasing a single clear note that drifted through the quiet forest. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment and smiled, not because he imagined Samuel somewhere beyond the mountains, but because he no longer needed to imagine anything at all. The promise had been kept, the waiting had ended, and peace had quietly taken its place where regret had once lived. Winter arrived quietly in the mountains, but the old cabin never felt forgotten again. Snow gathered gently across the roof, resting on the pine branches like soft white blankets, while thin ribbons of smoke rose peacefully from the stone chimney on weekends when Ethan returned. Ranger loved the changing season. Every fresh snowfall became another reason to wander the familiar trails, leaving neat paw prints beside Ethan's sturdy boots as they crossed the silent forest together. The little bronze bell still hung beneath its weathered beam, its clear tone drifting across the valley whenever the mountain wind found its way through the trees. Travelers occasionally paused along the old logging road after hearing stories about the restored cabin. Some arrived carrying heavy memories hidden behind polite smiles. Others simply wanted to escape the noise of everyday life for a little while. Ethan welcomed everyone exactly the same way. A warm fire, fresh coffee, two empty chairs on the porch facing the sunrise. Ranger greeted each visitor with gentle confidence, approaching slowly before quietly settling nearby, never demanding attention, yet somehow making every stranger feel less alone. One snowy afternoon, an elderly veteran climbed the porch with careful steps, leaning heavily upon a wooden walking stick. He admitted that he had not spoken to another former Marine in nearly 15 years. Ethan simply poured 2 mugs of coffee and invited him to watch the falling snow. For almost an hour, neither man spoke more than a handful of words. They listened to the crackling fire, the soft movement of wind through the pines, and the steady breathing of the German shepherd sleeping peacefully between their chairs. Before leaving, the older veteran paused beside Ranger, gently resting one weathered hand upon the dog's head. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Thank you." Ethan understood he was not speaking only to the dog. The cabin had become exactly what Samuel always believed it could be. Not a monument to loss, but a quiet refuge where people no longer needed to explain every invisible burden they carried. Spring eventually returned, melting the snow into sparkling streams that wandered through carpets of wildflowers surrounding the cabin. Birds built nests beneath the porch roof. Fresh green leaves unfolded across the aspens. Ranger, now a little slower but just as loyal, still walked every familiar trail with calm determination, though he often paused beneath the great white pine overlooking Samuel's resting place. Ethan always stopped beside him. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. They simply stood together for a few peaceful moments before continuing home. On the morning of another September 18th, exactly 1 year after Ranger first sat outside the forgotten cabin, Ethan rose before sunrise and prepared coffee, just as Samuel had taught him many years before. He carried 2 steaming enamel mugs onto the porch while Ranger settled comfortably beside the steps. The eastern sky slowly filled with soft shades of gold and pale blue. Mist drifted through the valley below exactly as it had on countless mornings before. Ethan lifted his mug gently toward the quiet mountains stretching beyond the pines. He no longer felt that he was honoring only one friend. He was honoring every promise that love refused to let disappear, every faithful companion who waited without complaint, and every ordinary sunrise that quietly offered another chance to begin again. The bronze bell rang once as the first sunlight touched the porch. Ranger looked toward Ethan with calm amber eyes before resting his head peacefully upon his front paws. Ethan smiled warmly into the new day, understanding at last that home was never just a place hidden among the mountains. Home was wherever loyalty, kindness, and remembrance chose to remain together, one quiet morning after another. Years passed as quietly as the changing seasons upon the Montana mountains, yet some mornings seemed untouched by time. Every September 18th, before the first light reached the eastern ridge, Ethan Walker unlocked the old cabin, lit a small fire inside the stone hearth, and prepared coffee exactly the way Samuel had once taught him. He always filled 2 enamel mugs. One remained in his hands. The other waited patiently upon the weathered porch railing, facing the valley where fog drifted between endless rows of pine trees. Ranger, older now with gentle silver beginning to appear around his muzzle, still climbed the porch steps before sunrise and settled into the same familiar place. His movements had become slower, but his amber eyes had lost none of their warmth or quiet wisdom. Visitors continued finding their way to the cabin without advertisements or signs. One person heard about it from a neighbor. Another learned of it from a fellow veteran. Some arrived carrying photographs folded inside old wallets. Others carried only silence. Ethan never asked why they came. He simply welcomed them inside, poured fresh coffee, and let the mountains do what words often could not. Ranger greeted every guest exactly as he always had, offering calm companionship instead of excitement. Children instinctively wrapped their arms around his neck. Older veterans rested weathered hands upon his shoulders. Those who struggled to find the right words often found themselves speaking naturally after a few quiet minutes beside the faithful German shepherd. Ethan noticed that Ranger always seemed to know who needed him most. On one cool autumn afternoon, a young Marine recently returned home stood alone near the porch after everyone else had left. He stared toward the valley with tired eyes, saying almost nothing. Ranger slowly walked beside him and gently leaned against his leg. Neither moved for several minutes. Finally, the young man smiled through quiet tears before whispering, "I think I can breathe again." Ethan looked toward the distant mountains and remembered something Samuel once wrote inside the old journal. Sometimes healing arrives so quietly that we mistake it for ordinary kindness. The words had never felt truer. As another September sunset painted the forest in shades of gold and crimson, Ethan carried Samuel's journal to the great white pine overlooking the valley. He placed one hand upon the smooth granite stone before opening the final page, where his own handwriting rested beneath Samuel's last entry. He added only one new sentence. "Your promise became someone else's beginning." He closed the journal gently and looked toward Ranger, who sat peacefully beneath the bronze bell as a gentle breeze stirred the faded blue ribbon tied beneath it. The clear note drifted through the trees exactly as it had on the evening when everything changed. Ethan smiled softly. He finally understood that Ranger had never waited outside an empty cabin because he expected someone to return. The faithful German shepherd had waited because love sometimes requires extraordinary patience before a wounded heart is ready to listen. The cabin had never truly been empty. It had been quietly filled with friendship, memory, gratitude, and promises strong enough to outlive the people who first made them. As the final light disappeared beyond the mountains, Ethan and Ranger began the familiar walk home beneath towering pines whose branches whispered gently overhead. Their shadows stretched together across the old trail, one man and one loyal dog moving side by side without hurry. Behind them, the little bronze bell rang one final peaceful time before settling into silence. Some stories end with applause. Others end with grace. And sometimes the greatest miracle is simply discovering that faithful love never stopped waiting, even when we believed we had wandered too far to find our way home.